Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
I remember the exact moment it hit me, the moment I realized that in my family, no matter how much I achieved, it would never be enough, and I would always be the shadow behind my brother. The one who got overlooked and dismissed even when I was clearly capable of more than anyone gave me credit for, and it happened during what was supposed to be a happy family dinner, a celebration we were all pretending to enjoy, with laughter and clinking glasses that felt empty and rehearsed when Mom, in the middle of raising her glass and smiling like everything was perfect, leaned across the table and said, with that tone that made it clear she had rehearsed it 1,000 times for maximum effect, "Your brother's the star, not you." And she said it as if she was announcing some universal truth that required no debate, no acknowledgement of all the times I had carried projects, handled crises, and quietly kept the family from looking foolish in front of others, and I forced a smile, swallowed the tight knot of anger in my chest, and silently cleared my plate, feeling every ounce of injustice press down on me, and for a moment I considered saying something sharp, something that would make her rethink the audacity of her statement. But I knew that arguing would only reinforce her point in her mind, that any demonstration of frustration from me would be read as weakness, and instead I sat there, letting the words sink in while my brother, sitting opposite, looked like he had swallowed a sweet he didn't like, proud and smug one second, pale and uncertain the next, completely unaware of how fragile his position had become in the eyes of anyone paying attention. No one else at the table seemed to notice, or maybe they did and chose to look away, but then my colleague, who had been invited because she was a family friend and had worked with my brother in the past, raised one eyebrow at me in a way that instantly made me feel less invisible, and she said in that calm, slightly incredulous tone that carried authority without aggression, "Odd, he asked me for an internship last week." And the words hung in the air between us like a spotlight exposing something my family had never noticed or chosen to acknowledge, and my brother went pale, his face losing all the color it had moments before when he thought he was the unquestioned favorite, and he shifted in his chair, scrambling for an explanation, for some way to make the remark seem harmless or irrelevant, but there was none, because the truth was impossible to cover up, and I could see him calculating his next words, his ego wincing with each passing second as he realized that for once, someone outside the family, someone whose opinion actually mattered in a professional sense, could see right through the carefully constructed image he had relied on for years. I remember my mind racing in that moment, thinking not only about the humiliation he was feeling, which was satisfying on a quiet, personal level, but also about the opportunity it presented, the subtle opening to change the way the family, and anyone who cared to notice, viewed him, and to finally step into a position where my own abilities, my intelligence, and my work ethic could not be ignored, dismissed, or minimized, and I realized that this was the moment that everything could begin to shift if I chose to act with patience and precision rather than emotion, because one rash move would ruin the impact. One slip of temper would make me just another person whining about favoritism, whereas a calculated response could dismantle the narrative that had always placed him on a pedestal while leaving me in the shadows. I pushed back my chair slowly, deliberately, pretending to stretch, and offered a small, polite smile to my colleague, acknowledging her words without saying anything to my brother, letting the silence do the work, letting the tension speak for itself, because I knew that nothing I said aloud could match the weight of the truth she had just exposed, and I watched him sit frozen, swallowing hard, and I felt a surge of something I had been craving for years, a combination of vindication and power. Knowing that from this moment forward, the game had changed, and I would not allow anyone, especially not him or my family, to underestimate me again, but I also understood that this was just the beginning, that the real moves had yet to come. And the best part was that he had no idea what was coming, and that thought alone made me smile quietly to myself as the room carried on with small talk, oblivious to the storm that had already started, right there in the middle of the dinner table. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the way my brother had gone pale, the way his composure had cracked in front of everyone without anyone realizing exactly what had happened, and I kept replaying the moment in my mind, analyzing every detail, every hesitation in his voice, every flicker of panic in his eyes, because I knew that understanding him was the first step to gaining any kind of leverage, and I also knew that if I rushed, if I acted without thinking, I would ruin the chance to truly turn the tables in a way that was complete, satisfying, and indisputable, so I decided to approach the situation with patience and precision, quietly gathering information under the radar while continuing to perform my role in the family, the professional world, and the social circles where my brother still thought he had power, all the while making sure that no one could suspect that I was already several moves ahead, and in those days that followed, I became almost obsessive about noticing inconsistencies, small exaggerations, moments where he claimed credit for something that wasn't his, and patterns in the way he tried to manipulate others without anyone noticing. Because I had learned the hard way that the truth is often hidden in the details, and if you pay close attention, it will reveal itself slowly but inevitably, and I had never been someone who ignored details. I started asking subtle questions to people I trusted, colleagues and friends who had worked with him or crossed paths in ways my family would never know about, and I made it sound casual, almost like curiosity, while I was really verifying the network of lies he had spun around himself, and what I discovered was staggering, not just because of the obvious deceit, but because it revealed how much of his so-called success was dependent on other people bending rules, helping him without receiving acknowledgement, and quietly covering for mistakes that he had made, and as I compiled this in my head, organizing the facts in a way that could one day be revealed without me ever having to raise my voice or appear aggressive, I began to imagine the moment when all of this would intersect in a way that would make him realize, once and for all, that his advantage had been an illusion, and the very same people he thought he had controlled would see him exactly as he was, and I could not suppress the excitement that came with realizing that this was not about revenge in the petty sense. It was about justice, clarity, and finally stepping into the space that I had been denied for so long. Every family interaction became an exercise in observation, where I noticed how his words subtly tried to diminish me, how his small smirks and nods were designed to remind everyone of his place, and I remained calm, polite, and unassuming, which made it even harder for him to anticipate what I was planning, because nothing about my demeanor suggested that I was aware of the full scope of his actions, and while he continued to believe he had the upper hand, I was quietly constructing a chain of events that would eventually leave him exposed, and every time he tried to insert himself into a conversation, claim credit for something, or remind everyone of his importance, I made mental notes of exactly how I could use that moment to amplify the impact of what I had already discovered, all while keeping my own accomplishments visible enough to remind myself that I was capable of playing this game with far more subtlety and intelligence than he ever had. There were nights when I lay awake thinking about the timing, considering how long I could wait to reveal the truth for maximum effect, because I understood instinctively that premature exposure could give him a chance to recover or spin the narrative back in his favor, and I also realized that my patience itself would become part of the strategy, because it would make the eventual revelation not just a personal victory, but a public one, impossible to deny, impossible to ignore, and utterly devastating to his carefully constructed image. And as I drifted to sleep each night, I felt the satisfaction of knowing that he had no idea that his next move would not be a triumph. It would be the beginning of the unraveling that he had so arrogantly assumed he could avoid, and that knowledge alone gave me a quiet sense of triumph even before the plan had fully begun to play out. The weeks that followed the dinner felt like walking through a minefield where every conversation with my brother, every interaction in family gatherings, and every professional encounter was an opportunity to observe, to calculate, and to set the stage for what I knew had to come next, because the truth, once revealed at the right moment, would not only undo the facade he had built so carefully but would also establish that I had been quietly, patiently, and decisively in control the entire time, and I quickly realized that timing and subtlety were my greatest weapons, because any overt confrontation would allow him to scramble, lie, or manipulate perception in his favor, and I had no intention of giving him that chance, which meant that every smile I offered, every polite comment I made, and every word I exchanged had to be intentional, carrying the weight of someone who was aware of the truth but was choosing to remain calm, composed, and untouchable, and it became a strange game of restraint, of performing normalcy while the storm I was orchestrating gathered momentum silently behind the scenes. I began arranging small, seemingly casual meetings with colleagues who had worked with him, people whose opinions mattered in ways he underestimated, and I asked pointed questions disguised as curiosity, noting inconsistencies in his statements, exaggerations, and moments of overconfidence, and I carefully documented everything in my mind, storing it not in a notebook because I did not want a physical record that could be discovered, but in a mental ledger, precise and detailed, like a strategy waiting to be executed. And I started to notice patterns that were too consistent to be coincidental, moments where he had attempted to manipulate situations for personal gain, moments where he had asked favors under the guise of professional necessity, and moments where his claims of competence were clearly inflated. And as I pieced these together, I realized that his credibility had gaps large enough to be exposed to anyone willing to pay attention, and that exposure, when it came, would be undeniable, because it would come not from me confronting him directly, but from people whose opinions he had sought to control, whose respect he had assumed was guaranteed, and whose trust he had violated without realizing I was already aware of the entire network of deception he relied upon. I started letting small hints slip into conversations, carefully calibrated comments that suggested knowledge I was pretending not to have, such as offhand mentions of deadlines he had missed or mistakes he had tried to cover up. And I watched his reactions closely, noting the brief flicker of panic, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his confidence wavered when he realized that someone else had noticed, and each moment gave me a sense of momentum. Proof that the strategy was working. Even before the larger revelation, because the cracks in his image were appearing naturally, triggered by nothing more than the awareness that I existed as a quiet observer who would not allow him to manipulate the narrative any longer. Meanwhile, I kept my own accomplishments visible in ways that felt organic but intentional, participating in projects that highlighted my abilities without drawing attention to the comparison with my brother. And I allowed colleagues and family members to see me excel in subtle, undeniable ways, so that the contrast between what he claimed and what I actually achieved became more apparent over time, and, while I remained polite and outwardly neutral, I could feel the tension building around him. A pressure he could sense but could not name, and I knew that the moment I revealed the culmination of all my observations, all my careful preparation, all my patience and strategy, it would be devastatingly effective. Not only humiliating him in a way he could not spin, but also establishing my position as someone who had been underestimated for far too long, and that anticipation, that quiet, almost electric satisfaction of knowing what was coming, made every interaction, every observation, and every calculated move feel like part of a masterful design, because I knew that this was not just about winning, it was about rewriting the narrative completely in my favor. The tension in the family had been building quietly, almost imperceptibly, over the weeks since that dinner. And I realized that it was time to begin testing the waters in a way that was visible enough to make an impact, while remaining subtle enough that no one could accuse me of being overtly confrontational. Because the ultimate goal was not to humiliate my brother in private, but to expose the cracks in his carefully constructed image in a way that would leave him powerless to respond and everyone else aware that I had been quietly, strategically, and effectively in control all along, so I started attending family gatherings with an almost deliberate composure, keeping my tone neutral, my expressions controlled, and my interactions polished, while planting small but precise pieces of information in conversations with relatives, friends, and colleagues who were present, carefully watching the way they processed the details I shared, noting which facts resonated, which moments caused surprise, and most importantly, which created subtle doubts about my brother's supposed achievements and integrity. because I understood instinctively that public perception was far more powerful than any private confrontation, and that once the network of people he relied upon began to question him, he would have nowhere to hide. I began weaving stories into casual remarks about work projects and professional experiences in which my brother had asked for favors, overstepped boundaries, or failed to deliver on promises, framing them as minor anecdotes at first, but allowing the implication to build in a way that was unmistakable to anyone paying attention, and I could see the effects immediately because my family and colleagues began asking questions, pausing when they heard my remarks, and exchanging subtle glances. That told me they were reconsidering the narrative they had accepted for years, and as I watched my brother shift in response, adjusting his posture, trying to redirect conversations, and offering explanations that were increasingly flimsy, I felt a quiet satisfaction that was almost electric, knowing that the first wave of exposure had begun, and the seed of doubt had been planted in the minds of everyone who mattered. At work, I orchestrated scenarios where my accomplishments were unavoidable and undeniable, leading meetings, presenting ideas, and completing projects with a precision and competence that highlighted the contrast between my results and the vague claims my brother had been making behind the scenes, and I noticed that he began to sweat, both literally and figuratively, attempting to claim credit in front of others while simultaneously being questioned by colleagues who had been tipped off gently about the gaps in his performance, and every time he stumbled, every time a colleague raised an eyebrow or asked for clarification about a story he had told, I felt the momentum shift further in my favor. Because the unraveling was no longer hypothetical, it was happening in real time, and he had no way to control it, no way to rewrite it, and no way to stop the growing recognition that he had relied too long on deceit, charm, and manipulation to maintain an illusion of competence and superiority. The most satisfying part was the way he became increasingly isolated without realizing it, as family members and colleagues began to subtly distance themselves from his assertions, rely on my insights, and seek my guidance, all without me ever having to demand respect or force acknowledgement, because the truth, presented with patience, observation, and calculated precision, always carries its own authority, and by the time he recognized the shift, it was already too late. The narrative had moved beyond his control, and the carefully constructed facade he had relied upon for years had begun to crumble visibly, leaving him vulnerable, exposed, and powerless, and in that moment, I understood that the real power lay not in anger or impulsive retaliation, but in quiet, deliberate, strategic execution. Because it guaranteed not only victory, but the kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing that every step had been planned, every action had been intentional, and the outcome was both inevitable and brilliantly undeniable. The day I had been planning for months finally arrived, and it carried with it a tension that was almost palpable. A sense of inevitability that made every step leading up to it feel like a carefully choreographed part of a performance in which I was both the director and the main actor, and I knew that every word I spoke, every reaction I allowed myself to display, and every interaction I participated in had to reinforce the narrative I had been building quietly and deliberately over the weeks. Because the ultimate goal was not just to expose my brother, but to do so in a way that was undeniable, public, and irreversible, leaving no room for him to spin, explain away, or manipulate the story. And I approached the gathering with a calmness that belied the intensity of the emotions churning beneath the surface, aware that the culmination of all my observations, planning, and strategic patience was about to pay off in a way that would leave an impression on everyone present, and I could feel the anticipation building like a current running beneath the surface of a calm lake, invisible until the moment it erupted. I had arranged a seemingly casual lunch with my brother, our parents, a few extended family members, and one colleague from work whose involvement was critical, because I knew that the credibility of the revelation depended not only on the facts themselves, but on the authority and impartiality of the person who would confirm them. And I had spent weeks ensuring that this colleague had witnessed firsthand the interactions in which my brother had misrepresented himself, exaggerated claims, and attempted to manipulate situations to his benefit, and I trusted that their testimony, when presented subtly yet firmly, would be undeniable, and I began the meal with light conversation, easing into the familiar rhythms of family chatter, smiling and nodding while carefully observing my brother's body language, noting the slight tension in his posture, the way his hands trembled slightly when he reached for a glass, and the almost imperceptible shifts in his gaze whenever someone mentioned work. Because I knew he sensed that something was coming, something he could not predict and could not prepare for, and the awareness of his growing unease fueled a quiet satisfaction within me that I could hardly contain. As the conversation meandered toward professional achievements and past accomplishments, I allowed a few well-timed comments to slip into the discussion, casual enough to seem incidental, yet precise enough to create doubt and curiosity in the minds of those listening, and when my colleague raised an eyebrow and recounted the specific incident in which my brother had approached them for an internship under false pretenses, I saw the immediate shift in the room's energy, the subtle murmur of recognition, the quick exchanges of glances that said more than words ever could, and I watched my brother's face go pale, his composure unraveling under the weight of undeniable truth, and I felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing that the exposure was complete, that the illusion he had relied on for years was crumbling around him, and that every carefully planted observation, every subtle hint, every calculated display of competence I had made in the months prior had led to this moment of quiet, but devastating victory, because the realization that he could not manipulate anyone, not the family, not the colleague, not even the perception of his own achievements, had arrived, and there was no escape. I maintained my calm, letting the tension linger, allowing the room to process the truth while my brother struggled to find footing, and I saw my parents exchange looks of disbelief, their assumptions challenged, their admiration redirected. And I understood that the final, decisive act of exposure had shifted the entire dynamic in a way that would have lasting consequences, because I had not only revealed his deceit, but had done so with precision, strategy, and patience that left everyone aware of the contrast between his image and the reality, and as I quietly sipped my drink, observing the ripples of recognition and shock, I knew that the culmination of all my planning, restraint, and execution had delivered a victory that was not just personal, but brilliant in its execution, leaving no question about who had been underestimated, who had acted with intelligence, patience, and control, and who had truly emerged as the person in charge, because in the end, the truth had a way of surfacing, and when it did, it could not be denied, explained away, or undone. The next few days after the lunch felt almost surreal, as though the world had tilted slightly on its axis and left me watching everything from a vantage point where I could see the impact of what had unfolded. Because the consequences of exposing my brother's manipulation were already beginning to ripple through both our family and our extended circles, and I could sense the tension whenever anyone mentioned work, past achievements, or future plans, knowing that my parents were no longer looking at him the same way, and that the carefully maintained illusions he had relied on for years were now fragile, transparent, and impossible to defend. And I realized that the brilliance of the plan lay not only in the moment of revelation itself, but in how it had subtly rewritten the perceptions and loyalties of everyone involved, quietly, irreversibly, and with a precision that left no room for excuses or misinterpretation, because by allowing facts to speak through the voice of someone credible, rather than confronting him directly, I had ensured that the truth had authority and weight that even he could not challenge. In the days following the event, I found myself receiving unexpected messages from colleagues, friends, and even family members who had witnessed subtle signs of my brother's behavior and now felt validated in their observations, which only reinforced the sense of satisfaction I carried, but also reminded me that the impact of the exposure was growing beyond my immediate control, because what I had orchestrated had tapped into a larger pattern of recognition, a network of small truths that had gone unnoticed or ignored until the final, undeniable confirmation. And as I read the messages and listened to the quiet acknowledgments from people who had long suspected something was off, I understood that my approach had not been about humiliation, vengeance, or confrontation, but about creating an environment where the facts themselves would act as an unassailable force, gradually and inevitably reshaping perceptions and establishing a new reality that could not be argued against or dismissed, without appearing foolish, dismissive, or complicit. Meanwhile, my brother was forced into an uncomfortable reality where every interaction became a careful negotiation, every attempt at self-promotion met with skepticism, and every effort to regain the confidence of family, friends, or colleagues now required him to confront a past filled with manipulation, exaggeration, and misrepresentation, because the revelation had fundamentally altered the lens through which he was seen, and I observed. With a mix of satisfaction and cautious patience, the way he stumbled through conversations, avoided topics he had once dominated, and sometimes seemed unable to maintain the facade he had perfected for so long, because the truth, once revealed, has a way of constraining even the most practiced actors. And I had orchestrated a truth that was both precise and undeniable, leaving him with no recourse other than to navigate the fallout with an honesty he had never learned to employ. As the week went on, the subtle shifts became impossible to ignore, and even casual interactions carried the weight of what had occurred, because people now approached decisions, conversations, and collaborations with a newfound awareness that my brother's track record and credibility were not what they had once seemed, and I realized that my role in this transformation, while quiet and deliberate, had delivered a result that felt both emotionally satisfying and strategically brilliant, because I had achieved not just the exposure of deception, but the permanent restructuring of trust, perception, and authority within our family and professional circle, leaving him with the realization that the game had changed, that the advantage he had relied on for years had been lost, and that from this point forward, he would be navigating a world in which the truth, rather than appearances or manipulation, dictated respect, influence, and acknowledgement. And I could finally allow myself to step back, knowing that the plan had succeeded in a way that was thorough, undeniable, and, in its quiet effectiveness, profoundly satisfying.